After Dungeons and Dragons debuted in 1974, many other companies began to capitalize on the new genre of gaming that it had introduced. And as early as 1975, there were other competitors to the game. We're going to talk about the first 4 post Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games today on Daddy Rolled a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that founded it, Tactical Studies Rules, and its later descendant company, TSR Hobbies. So today I'm going to be talking about how Dungeons & Dragons created a new genre of gaming in 1974 when it was published in January, and it effectively controlled a 100% share of that audience of role-playing games during that first year. So those terms are a little bit kind of fluid because at the time they didn't realize that they were creating a new genre of game. That was kind of a byproduct. So if you see here on this cover, it says rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. So really, even though this is a derivative of Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign, that's kind of how this got started. This was really thought of for the most part as being like a variant of war games, not a role-playing game, not creating a new genre. However, that being said, the point is of this audience that was getting into this style of game, Dungeons & Dragons was really the only competitor for that first year. Now, I am going to talk a little bit about history here before I get into the meat of the video, which is talking about the first games that were published in the wake of Dungeons & Dragons, the first role-playing games that were published in the wake of Dungeons & Dragons, and what they had in common, what they had, what their differences were, and why those particular games were published. But before we get there, I briefly need to talk about another game that I know someone will bring up. If I don't bring it up, so I'm just going to do it now. In 1974, after D&D is published, there is a game published, I'm using quotes because I think saying it was published is very generous. It's called Rules for the Game of Dungeon. And the short version is someone was playing what were called dungeon games as part of the Midwest Military Simulationist Association, I believe it's called. And it seems like someone within that group must have played D&D or at least heard about it or knew about it or read it or something. And so they were playing these games that were influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. One of the people in that group that had played these dungeon games then created a type of game that they called Castle Keep and ran that game. And someone who played Castle Keep was realizing that this was a fun game and a lot of people were playing, but they were all playing it different because the rules weren't codified. And so this person took on the laudable goal of figuring out how to codify these rules so that people could play Castle Keep in a similar fashion at different conventions when they interacted with each other. And so it was an 18-page document that was basically like photocopied or mimeographed and published and then distributed at, I think it was the World Science Fiction Convention or something like that. But there were 50 copies of this. So I just don't consider that to be published. And I'm not denigrating the game. I'm not saying it's bad for people that do that self-publish and put things out in the world that way. This is not a dig against that. I just think that terms have meanings. And when I think of something being published, I'm thinking of something that is commercially available to a wide audience where it can get some traction and it's available when you want to go look for it, right? So nowadays with digital publishing, that's different because everything can be gotten at any time digitally. But back in the day when it was all print products, something as small as a 50 print run 18-page copy of rules that was distributed at a single convention was never going to get the traction that it needed in order for a lot of people to start playing it. So while some would say it was the second published role-playing game, I don't say that. I think it's an interesting piece, and it's an artifact of gaming history, and it's important to discuss it. I don't consider it the second published role-playing game. All right. So that being said, we also need to talk a little bit about the history of Tactical Studies Rules and its 3 founders, because these 3 founders are going to affect the direction of where role-playing games go in 1975 and beyond. So the original two founders of Tactical Studies Rules are Gary Gygax, whom everyone, I hope by this point on the channel, knows who that is, and his childhood friend, Don Kay, both born in 1938. They're the same age, roughly. And they each were war gamers and friends, and they each contributed $1,000 to create this company and become the founders of Tactical Studies Rules. Okay, with the point of wanting to publish Dungeons and Dragons, which Gary Gygax had been working on for over a year at this point, after having been exposed to Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. And Gary started playtesting his Blackmoor game that he called Greyhawk. And in the second Greyhawk game ever run by Gary Gygax, Don Kay was one of the players, playing a character named Merlin. And we can talk more about that later. But Merlin has a storied history in the world of Greyhawk. Even to this day, he's now a deity in the world of Greyhawk. So Gary and Don create Tactical Studies Rules October of 1973. But their $2,000 that they put in is not enough money to publish Dungeons and Dragons. And so what they did instead was publish more as, a safer bet, which was a military medieval, or not medieval, but a military war game, Cavaliers and Roundheads. So like, English Civil War time period, with the idea that the proceeds from that would then be used to publish Dungeons and Dragons. However, that game just doesn't sell as well as they were hoping. And so in December of 1973, a third gentleman enters the Tactical Studies Rules, universe. And that is a man by the name of Brian Bloom. Brian is 12 years younger than Gary. He's born in 1950, and he's introduced, it seems like, most likely was introduced to Gary Gygax at Gen Con 6 in 1973 by a man of the name John M. Seaton, and that name's going to come up in a minute here, but I guess it was like a mutual friend that introduced them. So Brian Bloom goes to Gary and Don Kay and says, I have $2,000 to contribute for an equal share in the company. And they agree, and they then publish Dungeons and Dragons in January of 1974. Okay, so you've probably heard of Gary Gygax. There's a very good chance you've heard of Brian Bloom. However, Don Kay is the third important person, and he does tend to get overlooked sometimes. And I'm going to talk about why in a minute. It's a very sad story, but his importance is such that the original logo for Tactical Studies Rules from 1974 or 1973 even is GK. And I've heard people before say that stands for Great Kingdom, like Gary's, Great Kingdom from the World of Greyhawk. This stands for Gygax and Kay. That's what those two initials are for. Those are the two founders. That's how important Don Kay is to the history of role-playing games and the genre that they created. So Dungeons and Dragons is published in January 1974. It sells its first 1,000 copies. It takes 11 months. And so then another 1,000 copies are printed, which are going to take about 6 months to sell. So things are looking good for TSR. They've created this game. It's off to a slow start, but it's selling. People are talking about it. There's a buzz. And they have, at the time, no competition. It's going to come quickly, but for the time, they kind of own this little corner of the market. But they're not going to slow down. They're going to keep going. And so they move into 1975 with big plans. And then, unfortunately, there's a disaster that happens. Tragedy. Don Kay dies of a heart attack on January 31st, 1975, at the age of, roughly 36 years old. And it's, completely unexpected. So, to die of a heart attack at that young of an age is just, it's a tragedy. And so a lot of things are going to happen. I'm not going to get into the whole history of this, but eventually what's going to happen is that Tactical Studies Rules is going to have to dissolve. So Don Kay's wife takes over his third share of the ownership, but she has no interest in being part of a game publishing company. And so eventually they're going to dissolve Tactical Studies Rules, and Melvin Bloom, who is Brian Bloom's father, is going to come and buy out her shares, and they're going to create a new company called TSR Hobbies. So that's why in my introduction, when I say Tactical Studies Rules and one of its descendant companies, TSR Hobbies, that's why I say that. A lot of people get confused and they think that Tactical Studies Rules and TSR is the same thing. It's not. TSR Hobbies was never called Tactical Studies Rules because it is a new company that was founded with the name TSR Hobbies. So it was an homage to Tactical Studies Rules, but is a different company with different ownership. So, but it takes a while. So that final sale and the transfer of assets doesn't happen until September of 1975. So for most of the year, Tactical Studies Rules is still publishing things. They do one of the first unique things in the history of gaming, which is publishing a supplement to an existing set of rules that expands the rules. So that's Greyhawk in 1975. So you guys have seen me talk about this before. And, I know I've talked about some of this, but this history is important to kind of understand what was happening in 1975. But they are doing something that is not very common in the gaming industry, which is they're not doing a revision, like a new printing, or where they're printing errata and like making the game different or better. They are doing, additional printings, but they are expanding the rules without replacing them by writing these supplements, which was not something that was common in the game industry. And that's something that we still have to today. And we kind of take for granted, like supplements come out with new classes and spells and things like that. But Greyhawk was sort of what set the stage for that becoming commonplace in the role-playing game genre. So they're also publishing war game rules. So, Warriors of Mars is miniature war games with, a John Carter of Mars kind of theme to it. Okay. But they also decide that they're going to publish some new, role-playing games. And the first one of those is going to be Boot Hill. So just to get it out of the way now, in case you don't make it farther into the video, you see I've got Empire of the Petal Throne here. If you've seen my video where I talk about the second published role-playing game, and I say it's this, I'll explain later why I say it's second, even though this was published chronologically after Boot Hill, kind of. And so we'll talk about that. And again, this is where terminology can get a little bit muddied, because exact records weren't always kept. And also, Boot Hill could be considered more of a war game or an individual man-to-man combat game than a role-playing game, even though it has elements of both. So all of these things can kind of muddy the waters as far as like what was first, as far as being the second role-playing game after Dungeons and Dragons. That being said, let's dive in and talk about Boot Hill. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about for the next little bit in this video, I'm going to cover 4 different games, role-playing games, that were published in 1975. And I'm going to talk about the people that created the games, the individuals involved in the writing and the art when I have that information available, and sort of what they end up contributing to the hobby in the future. And then we're also going to talk about some of the game mechanics. And I'm not going to go over every page of every book. And this isn't really a review. It's not intended to be, it's more of an overview. It's a top line overview of these 4 games, and sort of talking a little bit about, when I say mechanics, really I'm comparing it to original D&D, because that was the basis of comparison at the time when these 4 games were published. The only role-playing game that people had to look at as an example and for inspiration was original Dungeons and Dragons, those 3 books in the box set that we showed earlier. Okay. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the legacy of these games in the future of the role-playing game genre. And so, again, if there's specific details that you want to hear more of, so I know after my video that I did on Gamma World, a lot of people said, hey, can you do the same video about like Boot Hill or Top Secret or things like that? So if that is something that you want more detail on Boot Hill than what I'm talking about here, let me know in the comments, and I can always add that to like a potential future video. All right, but let's talk about Boot Hill, the second, quote unquote, role-playing game published by Tactical Studies Rules. As you see here, this is not a TSR Inc. This is Tactical Studies Rules, published in 1975. So unfortunately, exact printing dates for things like this are not necessarily easily available. So we know that Greyhawk was published in the spring. Some people say March, so I don't know about Greyhawk. The foreword to Boot Hill, which is, you're going to see here in a second, written by Gary Gygax, the foreword is dated, I think it was May 1st, 1975. So obviously Boot Hill was then published after that. How much after, I don't know. I think it's reasonable to assume a 2-month delay between the writing of the foreword and the actual printing and distribution, like a minimum of 2 months. So maybe July is a reasonable guess for the date of the month of when Boot Hill went on sale. But that's just an educated guess at this point. So, but the reason that's important is because the other role playing game that TSR is, or Tactical Studies Rules, is going to publish in 1975, which is Empire and the Petal Throne, most likely wasn't published until at least at the earliest September. So, in a similar fashion, if I remember correctly, the forward to that was written in July of 1975. So, again, using our kind of 2-month rule of thumb, that would mean that the earliest we would probably see print copies of the box set of Empire of the Petal Throne would be in like September. Okay, so let's jump now back to Boot Hill and talk about why was this game published? Why do a Western? And as we see here, this is the cover. I unfortunately don't own this. This is the first edition of the game, and I don't own this as a print copy. I do own the second edition, which was a box set similar in fashion to the Moldvay box set. So it was published in 1979. This is 1975, and it's published as a small book, similar in scale to one of the little brown books from the 3 original books from Dungeons and Dragons. So it's that size. It's roughly A5, I believe it's called, in the printing world. It's like half of an 8.5 by 11, I think, is roughly, and then turn sideways. So Don Kay, as we talked about, was a huge fan of the Western genre. So Westerns, like these guys kind of grew up on, Gary Gygax and Don Kay. They grew up on a diet of science fiction, and we've talked about Gary Gygax's, his predilection for science fiction and weird comics and fantasy, that genre of things. But another very, very popular, and perhaps even more popular in terms of its influence on pop culture at the time, was the Western genre. So books and particularly movies. Okay, so Don Kay was a big fan of that, and so uh, his character of Merlin, which we talked about before, that was a fantasy character in Gary Gygax's Greyhawk campaign. Gary actually, at a certain point, transports Merlin to like an Old West scenario, and that's where Merlin, the character, picks up his characteristic cowboy hat, his gun belt with his 6 guns. That Gary later says, "Oh, those are like magic firing wands," kind of thing. But that's because the character adventured in a Wild West setting when being played by being run in a game by Gary Gygax. So Don Kay was a big fan of the Western, and they were working on this game in 1974 when Don was still alive. And so with his passing away, Gary and then Brian Bloom publishing Boot Hill, that was sort of their homage, and they're honoring Don Kay because he was so instrumental in getting Tactical Studies Rules off the ground and helping to publish Dungeons and Dragons, which is why they were able to publish Boot Hill in the first place, was because they were generating income from the sale of Dungeons and Dragons. So this is an homage, and it's of the time period because, again, Westerns were very popular. So you'll see here, again, the word role-playing game, or the term role-playing game, is not used on the cover. Rules for Wild West, gunfights and campaigns with miniature figures on a man-to-man scale. That's what this game is, published by Tactical Studies Rules. We see the Gygax K logo, and then the price of $5. All right, this artwork here is by Tracy Lesh, and we're going to talk about him in just a second. All right, but that's the cover art. So let's go into... pardon me here. Let's go into the first couple of pages. So we have some more artwork here, and this is again by Tracy Lesh, and on the left there. And then you see, again, just the cover page, Boot Hill, the repeating of what it says on the cover, Brian Bloom and Gary Gygax. And we talked about Brian Bloom just a few minutes ago. So again, the third kind of main person in the foundation of Tactical Studies Rules. When TSR Inc. or TSR Hobbies Inc. is founded, Brian Bloom becomes the majority shareholder at the time, and his father Melvin was the third, and then was the second, pardon me, and then Gary Gygax was the third in terms of what they were contributing in their ownership in the company. So Gary just had less money than the Bloom family. So there's a long story about the Blooms and what happens between them and Gary Gygax. But right now, everyone's friends. We're all friends. Okay, so Brian Bloom and Gary Gygax. And then you see the illustrations here by C. Lesh, all first initials. So I'm telling you, folks, this is very difficult to track down. C. Lesh, T. Lesh, J. Seaton, and K. Beatty. Okay, so The name that I knew right away was T. Lesh. That's Tracy Lesh. It's Tracy is a man, and I am Twitter friends with him. So not friends is generous. We follow each other. I'll just put it that way. And Tracy still does art and has a very interesting story. The short version is Tracy was a high school student that went to high school, I believe, with Gary Gygax's daughter Heidi. I'm pretty sure they were at the same grade, or at least they knew each other at the school. And Heidi saw Tracy's drawings, asked if she could show them to her father, Gary, who was impressed by Tracy's art skills, and had him work on some illustrations for the tournament scenario of Tomb of Horrors. So I'll put some pictures up here from my copy of Art and Arcana. It's a fantastic book on the history of Dungeons and Dragons art. It's probably, I'll say, the best Dungeons and Dragons related book that Wizards of the Coast has ever published is Art and Arcana. Because not only does it show art throughout the history, but it really does provide a history of Dungeons and Dragons, the game. But Tracy Lesh does the original drawings for the Tomb of Horrors that are then redone when it is published as an official adventure in the 70s by TSR. And so a lot of his original drawings were reinterpreted by people like Dave Sutherland, and I think even Trampier worked on some of those as well. But the originals were done by Tracy. So Tracy also is going to end up doing artwork for Blackmore Supplement 2. So I'll put a picture up here. This is from my collection, my personal collection, Blackmore. But the Roper and the Mind Flayer first illustrated, or first debut even, in Blackmore Supplement 2, but Tracy does the artwork for those. So their iconic look was first defined by Tracy Lesh. So I think it's really fun that you've got, you're showing the scrappiness of this company by having essentially a high school student doing artwork for these games, which I think is, it just kind of shows the evolution of this hobby, where it's like a multi-million-dollar company now, and they spend tons of money on art and artists and things like that. But it started out with, a friend of the daughter of one of the founders of the company doing art kind of on the side. So that's Tracy Lesh. Now, C. Lesh is Charles Lesh, who is Tracy's father. I can find almost no information about Charles other than he's Tracy Lesh's father. I don't know about his history of art and, whether he was a professional artist or anything like that. So if anybody has any information about that, drop it in the comments below and let me know. All right, now Jay Seaton, this is John M. Seaton that we discussed before, the person that introduced Brian Bloom to Gary Gygax at, again, this is presumably Gen Con 6 in 1973. John Seaton is also going to end up writing a fun article in Dragon Magazine #2, which is going to be the next issue that I go over in my history of Dragon Magazine. So it was I think it was called it's basically an article about promotion, Monka's promotion in the arena of combat. So the Monk character class debuted in Blackmore Supplement 2, 1975, like I think October of 1975. And part of the original way the class was envisioned, and this carries on into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, is that monks, in order to advance to higher levels, had to fight a combat with the person of the level that they were trying to get to. And if they won, they advanced in level. And if they didn't, they actually got bumped down a level until they got the experience points back up to try again. So he writes an article about that. All right. And then unfortunately, the one person I can't find any information about is this last one here, Kay Beatty. I looked and looked. I looked in my copy of Art and Arcana, which I think is, basically the definitive guide to artwork done for TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. And I realized this is Boot Hill, not Dungeons and Dragons, but they use the same artist for pretty much everything. And I just couldn't find anything. So again, if anybody knows anything about Kay Beatty, I would love to know Kay Beatty's first name even, and just any history that you have. So again, please leave that in the comments if you have that. All right, so there we've talked about the creators and sort of who's involved with this. So Boot Hill is an interesting sort of in-between game. Again, and I talked about this a little bit before, but it's really more of an individual gunfighter versus gunfighter, player versus player game that can be played without a referee. Then there are some small sections in here that talk about, oh, if you want to have an ongoing campaign, you would need a referee to adjudicate these different things. But there's really no character advancement in the game, for the most part. We're going to talk about that in a second, but nothing like what we think of as like leveling in D&D, where your character progressively gets better over time. And I think that was one of the things that held it back. So again, you're creating this new genre of gaming, and people didn't really know what it was that was making these games so popular with people. So I think, with hindsight, one of the things that D&D did that was very unique, and one of the things that helped propel it to the popularity that it has even today, 50 years later, is this idea of that carrot. You are advancing in level, and if you get just enough experience points, you can go to the next level and then unlock some extra goodies, like whether it's new spells if you're a magic user, your thief skills go up, you get new prayers if you're a cleric, or your fighting ability gets better if you're a fighter, right? So those are things that your character's going to get. So you had an incentive to keep adventuring in order to get more experience points to move up in level. However, that was a unique concept at the time. And so I'm not sure that some of these earlier creators of the games understood that that was such an integral part of what made these games so fun and so popular. So I just talked in my video about Gamma World, how there are really no level advancements in Gamma World and in Metamorphosis Alpha. Now, that game creator said he did that on purpose, partly because he didn't want to copy Dungeons and Dragons rules, because he was thinking to the future of, I might want to do something else with this game at a certain point, and I don't want it to be so closely tied to D&D that I don't own my rules, for lack of, I'm paraphrasing for James, so you can look up his exact quote for that, but that's essentially what he was thinking at the time. But I do think that was a missed opportunity, because again, I think one of the things that people really like about games like this is that character advancement. But anyway, we're going to talk about the foreword here for Boot Hill, and this is written by Gary Gygax, and so he's talking about it's an unusual way to war game because it's individual and personal. So it's not hordes of troops like people are used to. So again, it's that man versus man kind of thing. And he's talking about Wild West action from history, from movies, dime novels, and he says through television, even as they're getting older. Now this is the 70s, and so there's now, by this point, there's a long history of television westerns that have been out from the 50s and 60s. So then he jumps right in and says you're going to roll percentile dice to determine certain characteristics. So that's interesting in and of itself, because, as you remember, Dungeons and Dragons is using all of the polyhedral dice to create characters, and the D10 was not one of the original dice for Dungeons and Dragons. They used D20s, because D10s, like, they're not polyhedral, I think is the right word, or I forget the term, but essentially the D10 is the outlier. Every other die, the 4, 6, 8, 12, and 20, have a very specific way where, like, you can cut it and it's exactly half on both sides and like everything's equal. But the D10s are not like that, and they were created later. So originally, when you wanted to roll D10s, you actually rolled a D20 and it was numbered 0 through 9 twice, and you colored one half of it a different color so that you could tell whether you're rolling 10s or 1s. We've talked about that before. But anyway, this game is unique at the time because, remember, this is the second role-playing game that's essentially ever been widely published for distribution, and it's using strictly D10s. D10s are going to later become a hallmark of games like, say, Call of Cthulhu. And there's whole systems that are based on strictly percentile dice, but this one wasn't. And I think it's interesting that, unlike Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha, that use essentially the same 6 ability scores as D&D and roll them the same way through 3 6-sided dice, this game is going against that and using percentile dice. So kind of interesting. But it talks about here, and he's going to say reflex, aim, courage, and previous experience. Those are going to be your ability scores, and we'll get into that in a second. But he talks about Clint Eastwood movies are mild compared to a typical Boot Hill game, but games can be played as single events, or You can play them like, one after the other strung together, with the whole taking place in a general locale, basically a campaign. So he's saying that you can do that, but this game, the majority of the rules are going to focus on combat rules. So even if you look over here at the table of contents, you can see that the basic rules and the advanced rules are almost all combat related. There's a tiny little bit. There's one page at the end of the advanced rules for setting up a town and building interiors. And then there's optional rules, which go right back into combat. So that's the whole middle of the book. And then your campaign section of the book is 3 pages, 22, 23, and 24. And then you have your appendices and then your reference sheets. All right. So that's kind of the layout of this book. So he talks about how you're going to use, so there's basic and advanced rules in the same book. So you're going to start with basic, and then once you have that down, then you're going to add the advanced rules. That's what they suggest. He talks a little bit about Brian Bloom and how Brian is writing a series of Western articles which are appearing in the Strategic Review. I've talked about the Strategic Review before. I'll put a link to that video up here. I didn't go issue by issue. So if there's a specific article that you want to see from Boot Hill, let me know and I can pull that back up. Okay, so that's the forward. And then we get into the introduction. And again, remember, this is very early on. So a lot of the things that we, again, take for granted as being part of a role-playing game today, which is sort of like that introduction, like, what is a role-playing game and how do you play and how do you create a character stuff? That's not what this introduction is. This introduction is assuming that you are familiar with playing war games. You've already passed that hurdle. So it's not going to explain to you what that is. It's just basically laying out, you know, that you're playing this Western war game and that, you can make these different scenarios with your different characteristics that you're going to determine by rolling dice. And then, he just jumps right into it. Figures are then placed in the starting positions and then the game begins. So he says that he suggests the game's first few games be unrelated. And then he says those who play tested the rules, who are members of the LGTCA, that's the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, which is where the company named Tactical Studies Rules, that's where they got their name. It's an homage to the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association that Gary belonged to in the city of Lake Geneva. So once they were familiar with what was going on, the more enjoyable games were those that were related to each other. Again, the campaign. So that's the kind of stuff he's having to explain here is like, you can play a one-off game where you just shoot each other and see who wins, or you can do that again and then you create a campaign. So he says it's possible to create rigid scenarios in the manner of the two that are included herein. They suggest freeform play being more fun. So there are 2 mini scenarios at the end of this book. Then he goes into the scale of the figures. He talks about the time scale, but it's not a hard and fast scale, which is really interesting. It's a guide only. And then you get your characteristics here. So it's all determined with percentile dice, and you've got speed, personal bravery, personal accuracy, strength. So you're going to roll for all of those on a percentile basis, and then it's going to give you a descriptor of what that means. So if your speed is 1 to 5, you're slow. If you're 6 to 10, you're below average. I think it's really funny that the average for any of these doesn't hit at the 50% level. It's always less than that. And above average is usually also less than technically what would be considered average. Not sure how that naming aligned with these, if there was a reason for that. But it's interesting. We have talked about these ability scores before. If you saw my video on the why does D&D have 6 ability scores, I talked about how the genre of the game and the game mechanics influence what abilities that you use, and how TSR was good at recognizing that different types of games needed different ability scores, which kind of ended up not being the case as we get into the 3rd edition era of D&D and the D20 system, where everybody was trying to retcon any genre of game into that existing system. And people still do it with 5th edition today, where they'll say like, well, I'm comfortable with 5th edition, so I want to play a science fiction game. And rather than play Traveler or something like that, they'll say, oh, I'm just going to play, a science fiction version of 5th edition, which if that's what you want to do, great. That's no problem. But I do think that the genre does impact the mechanics, and one of those mechanics is the ability scores. But in any event, these are your scores here. And then you see that you get bonuses to your rolls. So it says if you roll for the personal figure for each player, if you roll a 1 to 50 on any of these scores, you're going to add 10% essentially. So if you roll a 51 to 70, you're going to add 5. And if you roll 71 or above, you add 0. So this is your way of like making your player characters a little bit better than the average person that would be in the game. Okay, and then it says for each successful showdown, such as an actual face-to-face gunfight, but not back shooting or dry gulching. He never explains what that means. The assumption is that you know what dry gulching is. But if you do a face-to-face showdown gunfight, and you win, for your speed, then you add 2 if it's under a score of 51, and you add 1 if it's over 81. If you bravery, if it's under 66, you add 2, and if it's under 91, you add 1. And then for your accuracy, you add 3 if it was under 26, 2 if it was under 21 or 51, and 1 if it was under 86. And then it says that's essentially they're halved if the success was 2 versus 1, but it's doubled if it was 1 versus 2. So that right there, that small little section at the end here of page 2, that's essentially your only character advancement in the whole game. That is your leveling system. You survive a gunfight, and your ability scores go up by a little bit, unless they were already high, in which case they're not going to really go up. Okay, so basically that's your advancement. So then he gets into the basic rules, and so that's it. That's in that one page right there, page 2. That's how you create your character. There are no classes. It's all human, of course, because this is a Wild West setting. It's not a Weird West setting. There's no magic. There's no monsters. There's no statistics in here for horses or any other kind of animals. Nothing. Okay, that's your characteristics, page 2. Then you get to your basic rules, which jump right into turn sequence. There are 2 possible turn sequences, and it talks about simultaneous movement, which is in advanced rules, but you're not using advanced rules, so you're going to do sequential movement, and it's going to be movement, then combat, then brawls. And so then he gets into what is movement, if you're on foot, and if you're crawling, walking, running and dodging, or just running. And then if you're mounted, you're walking, trotting, and galloping. And then he gets into this terrain, and you see things here like section 4, mounted movement turns. Galloping horses can curve at up to 60%, while walking or trotting horses can turn a full 90%. So that's because, again, this is intended to be played with miniatures on a grid. So you're measuring this out to see, these inches are being measured on a board or a grid using 25 millimeter or 30 millimeter, which is, they said you could use either one in this game. And so those turns are based on measuring things like that. Okay, so weapons, here's your weapon page, and it just talks about, the range in inches, the rate of fire, the weapon speed, the ammunition, how much it holds, and then the reloading and how long that takes. So targets covered, and then you get into your first shot, who gets to do the first shot, that kind of thing. Then you have your first shot chart. So you see what I'm saying? It's extremely combat heavy. There's nothing in here about adding personality to your character, because quite honestly, your character is probably going to die pretty quickly, and we're going to go over that in just a second. But you have your hit chart, and then they actually kind of break it up into different ways that you can do hits. But the fast hit location method here is at the bottom of page 7. So if you are hit, then on a die roll of 1 to 50, it's a light wound, and you subtract 3 from your strength. And if it's a roll of 51 to 85, it's a serious wound. You subtract 7 from your strength. And if it's a roll of 86 to 100, it's a mortal wound, and the figure hit is dead. So it doesn't matter how many gunfights you've been in. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how fast you are. If the other player rolls an 86 to 100 on percentile dice, if you've been hit, that's a 15% chance that it's a mortal wound. You are dead. Just that's it. So you see there's all these modifiers here. If you're running and crawling and running and dodging and galloping, modifiers on how you can be hit. But for the most part, that's why this game is so deadly. There's a 15% chance every time your character is hit that you're going to die. All right. Then if you do exact hit location, so now you've decided to not do the fast one, you're going to do the hit location chart. Once there's a hit, then you're going to make these die rolls to see, is it left leg or right leg, left arm or hand, right arm or hand, right shoulder, left shoulder, abdomen, right chest, head. And then was it a light wound, a serious wound, or a mortal wound? And that's going to happen by another die roll. So you see if it's a head wound, which is a 15% chance of a head wound, then there's a 60% chance that it will be mortal. So again, very, very deadly game. So again, a lot of people, I think, just didn't really get into the campaignability because characters would just die so quickly. All right. Then you get into some brawling rules for that. and a brawling chart. And then your advanced rules. So see, there's zipping through this very, very quickly. We're already about a third of the way through. So for the advanced rules, they talk about simultaneous movement. In the basic rules, it's one side moves, the other side moves. This one movement happens at the same time. And they get into hidden movement, which is something you can't do in the basic rules. And this is where it says a referee is needed in order to adjudicate hidden movement so that there's no arguments that result over one character saying they're hiding and the other one saying, no, I can see them, or whatever that is, right? You add vehicles in here, which were not part of the basic game. Firing while moving, arching your arrows. It deals with minor character morale. So minor character in this case is sort of like NPCs or hirelings. So the idea is that you've got your main character, but you might have a bunch of like backup. And for those particular cases, you have to roll morale in certain cases. And then it talks about morale for cavalry, for Indians, and then miscellaneous characters like typical shopkeepers, bank tellers, and bartenders. And then there's this whole chart here that gives you the roughly what the speed, gun accuracy, throwing accuracy, bravery, and strength and experience would be of these different types of characters that might be in the game: a detective, a drifter, or a gambler, or a bank teller, etc. Then you get into your very detailed explanation here on one page of how to set up a town, and then building interiors. So one of the things that it talks about is that it's actually expecting you to have terrain, like building terrain that you would use. And it says if you don't have that, you can draw it out like on paper, like 2-dimensional instead of 3D, and lay it down on your map. But the assumption is you have a map of what this town looks like, and you need to know where the buildings are, where the stables are, where the alleys, ways, the streets, so that you can move your characters around to have this gunfight. You need places to hide. And that's going to be important in this style of game. Okay, then you get your optional rules with first shot determinations, your grease lightning rule when you're rolling for speed. So it says consider so this rule is if you roll a 96 to 100 for your speed on character generation, each one of those numbers, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, is assigned a separate speed on the first shot chart. And that's like just adding more complexity, but allowing for faster draw characters. Talks about sharpshooting. Intoxication is funny. So it says alcoholic beverages affect people in different ways. For every 3 drinks a character takes, you subtract 5 from both accuracy and speed, but you add 5 to the bravery. And then for each 6 drinks, you add a point to your strength, but no more than 2 points may be added to strength in this fashion. So after 12 drinks, you get 2 points of strength, but you've also subtracted, multiple points from your accuracy and your speed, and you have added to your bravery. And then it talks about professional gamblers. So this is an interesting mechanic because it says, while most characters need no special rules, the gambler needs some special attention. So they have an ability that other characters don't have. So this could be considered, I guess, like a character class. You could say my character is a gambler, and then you would get to use this rule, which is that you roll percentile dice until you get a score of 50% or less. So once you get that, that's your number, right? So let's say it was 30. Then it says, this is your ability to avoid being caught when you're cheating. And then it says, when you're normally playing cards, you use a real deck if you want to during the game. But if the gambler's involved, that gambler uses percentile dice. So the high roll wins, and the gambler gains a plus 15 on the die roll. Okay, and then if the gambler wins 3 times in a row, the opponents get to check to see if they catch the gambler cheating by rolling percentile dice. And if they roll under that initial score, so remember I said, let's pretend it's 30. If they roll a 30 or lower, then they have caught the person cheating. They've caught the gambler cheating. It sounds complicated. It actually is not complicated. I thought it was kind of unique. It was a fun little addition to this game because it's creating non-combat rules, which is one of the few non-combat rules that's in this book. Again, to emulate the genre, because professional gambling is part of the Western genre. So then it talks about dynamite and how to use that. I have a very funny dynamite story from playing a Deadlands game, so different from Boot Hill, but it was it's a Western genre type game. But it talks about using dynamite and how that affects you, like your chance of death, your chance of a wound, or your chance to be stunned, depending on how close you are and how many sticks of dynamite you're using. Talks about misfires. So these are all optional rules. The stray bullet rule, Gatling guns, cannons. Got some nice art here. This is a piece by that K. Beatty person who unfortunately don't know who that is, but this is Butch Sundance and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with at a place there at the bottom. All right, so here's your little bit of on campaigns. So campaign game suggestions, and it says, tailor them to the needs of the players, which is interesting. But it basically says start out with a map, and then how you do scale on your map, and your movement rate, your roles and objectives. And it says the roles and objectives assigned to the participants should be commensurate within the scope of the campaign. That's a generic statement, doesn't really say anything, but basically talks about if you have a large area that you're covering and you're going to play for several years, then your characters are probably higher level people. And if you're playing on a more town-based, like a county that has one or two towns at most, your players are going to have smaller roles. So, it talks about, goals of like leading a gang of 3 outlaws into a town to rob the bank, escape to a hideout, and lay low for a month. That might be a goal of a smaller scope campaign, whereas a larger scope campaign, you might be represent a bunch of ranchers or be a cavalry commander or a sheriff or something like that. And then it talks about keeping the records of everything that's going on, and that the referee has to keep a record of that so the referee knows how much cash each player has on hand and their hirelings and associates and animals owned and all that kind of thing. Gets into posses, it gets into tracking rules, and then it gets into character aging. Gary was a big fan of these rules of aging. So we see this in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where he talks about you roll the age of the player characters in secret, and the player doesn't know at what age. You don't roll the age in secret, but you roll when they're going to die. Sorry, in secret. And so the player doesn't know at one point when their character is going to die of natural causes. And then he gives very detailed rules on what happens as your character ages and gets older. Your ability scores change. You lose strength and constitution and dexterity, but you gain wisdom and charisma and intelligence till a certain point, and then it's very complicated. It has very similar rules here. For speed, each game year you add 1% to the speed of the character up to the age of 25, but then after the age of 35, you subtract 1% per year. Accuracy, it's very similar. Except it's subtracted after the age of 40. Bravery, there's no effect, no matter your age. And then strength, you add 2% each year up to age 25, but then you subtract 2% each year after age of 35. Little picture there of Jesse and Frank James. Then you get your appendices, and these are the scenarios that they outline. So this is the gunfight at the OK Corral. And so they do it in such a way to like outline it as supposedly historically happened. And so they talk about who was actually there, and then they give them the game statistics here you see at the bottom of the page, where it details the speed, the gun accuracy, bravery, strength, and experience. And then it also says it's kind of weighted in favor of the Earp family and Doc Holliday. And so the kind of the compensation for that, sorry if you heard that, was my daughter and her friend coming home from their ice skating lessons. So but they said, you can add another character on the side of the McGlory and the Clanton gang. And that would be, I think it was Johnny Ringo, who they said was like an existing character at the time. Like he was around, he just wasn't there. And so they said, if you want to help that side kind of be balanced, put him on that side. But it's really interesting here. If you've ever seen the movie Tombstone, which I highly recommend, but they talk about in here the scores for people. So it gives Johnny Ringo a 99% speed. And then it says one co-author considers him to have a rating of 100. And then they put Doc Holliday at 98, which I think is interesting. But you see Doc Holliday's strength is only a 2 because he's racked with tuberculosis and he was an alcoholic. And then you see Ike Clanton's bravery is only a 15. So in the movie, if you remember, Ike was the one that ran out in the middle of the gunfight, said like, I'm not armed. And they told him like, get a gun or get out of the fight. So anyway, really kind of funny. And this is of course done way before that movie was ever made. So consistent with the the history of what we knew about what happened at this. So there's a fight here, and it basically says what you want to do is just start shooting. Like line your people up, put these people here, and then just start shooting. And then there's a map here on the left. You see a hand-drawn map of what the street would have looked like. And then the next one is the Battle of Coffeeville. This is the end of the trail for the Dalton gang. So very famous bank robbery that was attempted where the same gang tried to rob two banks in the same town at the same time. And it was a disaster. They never should have tried it. It had only been attempted once before. And for whatever reason, they were probably a little full of themselves of like their success rate. And so they tried this and ended up with basically everyone of the Dalton gang dying except for Emmett Dalton. So anyway, they talk about this, but then also it tells you like how to do a variant to kind of like, again, try to balance the sides out a little bit and have some different people involved. So here you have your table of the people that were there and their scores. And then you've got your hand-drawn map here, or hand labeled at least. And then you have your Appendix C, which is prices of equipment and like wages of how much you would charge month to month. For, like if you needed to have a cowboy on hand, $20 to $40 a month, a prison guard's $5 a day, that kind of thing. All right, so there's all your equipment. There's your picture of Belle Starr, another famous outlaw. By Kay Beatty. So it is interesting that you do see there are some women drawn in here, even though everything that's written rules wise says he. It always says he. But then they're showing you women that, so you could supposedly play a woman character in this particular game, which is very cool. So then it talks about Appendix D, a typical section of a town. And then building floor plans, just this tiny little paragraph about how to do that. And then your suggested reading. This is like your bibliography, the things that the creators were looking at in order to create this game. And it's interesting that it's all reading. So they don't talk about movies. They don't talk about TV shows. It's all books, mostly nonfiction in this particular case. So then you have your product list from TSR at the time, or sorry, from Tactical Studies rules at the time. So at this point in time, what's interesting is, I said it takes a while for these things to change over. So I believe the official date of when everything was done from Tactical Studies rules transferring over to TSR Hobbies is going to happen in September of 1975. So this was published prior to that because it still says Tactical Studies rules. And it talks about the games that were being published. So we just talked about Cavaliers and Roundheads, English Civil War miniatures rules, but you see D&D here is listed. Greyhawk Supplement 1 has been published by this time. War of Wizards, interesting, is going to come up later. You've got your Chainmail, rules for medieval miniatures, Tactics, Panzer Warfare. Here's Boot Hill, which is what you're reading. Classic Warfare coming soon. It's a little joke in the hobby about it. The coming soon it's definitely not soon. Let's put it that way. And then you can order dice and how much it costs. And you see percentile dice set, 2 20-sided dice. That was your percentile dice, again, because they didn't have 10-sided dice at the time. That didn't come until later. So you were going to play this with 2 20-sided dice, using them as percentiles by coloring in, each die a different color, or each, 0 to 9 twice, a different color in each die. Tells you to subscribe to the strategic review. We've talked about strategic review before. And that's it. Then you have all these charts at the back. These are your reference charts. So you're not having to open your book during the middle of the game. You could just have these out. Your hit charts, first shot, etc. And then your back cover. So that was a very, very long overview of Boot Hill. It was going to be longer than some of the other ones because I have talked about Empire of the Petal Throne before, so that's going to be very brief. And then, and I have played Boot Hill before. The other two games that we're going to talk about, which are On Guard and Tunnels and Trolls, it's going to be a lot more brief, and it's because partly this video is going to be way too long, but also On Guard, I think, is kind of a little bit unique in that it doesn't really have much of a legacy. Tunnels and Trolls is big enough that it probably at some point is going to deserve its own video. I actually don't have much of a history with Tunnels and Trolls, so this is going to be more of an introduction when we get to that point. And then later on, if you guys want something a little bit deeper, that's something that we can discuss doing. All right. So Boot Hill did have 2 more editions published over the years. So the first new edition was the second edition of the game, which was published in 1979, and that's the one that I have. So it came in this box set, and it came with a booklet, a map, some die cut counters, and dice. So my box has all that except for the dice. They weren't in here. But here's the die cut counters, and then the map, which is it's pretty big, so it's really not going to fit on camera here. I'll do my best. So this is side one, or not. It's not even side one. This is half of the first part of the map, which is kind of like they called it the campaign map. All right, and then you had this kind of town map on the inside. So that's the map. Rules-wise, second edition of Boot Hill is very similar to first edition, so much so that the foreword is pretty much exactly the same. It actually is exactly the same because it's the same one Gary Gygax wrote in 1975. Now, that there is a picture of Brian Bloom on his cowboy getup as like a wanted poster. Buckshot Bloom, wanted dead or alive. Okay, so now the art in here is done by David Sutherland III and by David Trampier. This one's edited by Mike Carr. So he kind of made the kind of new edits to the game, although the game is still written by Gygax and Bloom. So the introduction, very, very similar, but it's just, it's slightly expanded, okay? The layout is different. The organization is different. So you get into the basic rules. Your abilities are the same. And, I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically, most of it is going to be very, very similar. It's just kind of, expanding on things or explaining things a little bit better, and the organization is actually a lot better. And of course, it's 4 years later, so the layout, they had better access to new tools, and it shows in terms of being able to find things, and just even reading it, the typeface is better, the headers and things like that. So there's this fun chart in here, the fastest guns that ever lived. So it goes through, these are all historic characters, and it gives them, it rates them according to the statistics for Boot Hill. So that's all that. Your appendices, you still have your gunfight at the OK Corral, but, the map is new, but the setup is basically the same. And then same for the Battle of Coffeeville. You've got just a different map. Then you have your fictional player characters chart or non-player characters chart. So these are just made up NPCs that you can use. A few more appendices talking about towns and things like that. There's kind of like a fictional town that they add in here, Promise City in El Dorado County. So that's all in there, designing your own scenarios. But again, very, very similar. They've taken out the inspirational reading from there. Here's your, you have a player character sheet, which the first game didn't have. So, and then one thing that this edition had, second edition, was they published some miniature figures that you could use with the game. So then in the, we'll say 1990, the game's revised again, the third edition, which changes a lot of things. They changed the ability scores that you can use. They add a skill system to the game, and it's much more focused on running campaigns, but it's not really compatible with either first or second edition. So, I think as far as the legacy of the game, so one of the things that I think is very tough and that kind of made it difficult for people to get into and to have a long lasting legacy as far as role-playing games. So the first edition of the game, 1975, there was no support material. The game was published and then that was it. So for Dungeons and Dragons, you had these continuing supplements coming out, Greyhawk, Blackmore, Eldritch Wizardry. You have the outdoor geomorphs, the monster and treasure assortments, that kind of thing. And then, finally in 1978, you had published adventures by TSR. But prior to that, we've talked about this before, starting as early as I think it was 75 or maybe early 76, you have adventures being published by other companies. We Warriors was publishing stuff. And then, of course, Judges Guild. So you had support material for Dungeon Masters to run the game. Boot Hill had none of that until this version came out in 1979. So 4 years later. And then this is supported with a referee screen and a mini adventure and then 5 adventures, modules. And so it did have support, maybe a little too late kind of thing. Third edition really had no support to speak of. So, and again, it was different game. Now there is a section in the Dungeon Master's Guide, I meant to grab it, but we have talked about it before, where Gary Gygax does write an article, 1979, first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, a small section in there where he talks about 6 guns and sorcery. And essentially the idea is, running a Boot Hill character in a D&D campaign or vice versa. Like there's some kind of portal that transports one from the other, which is, of course, we talked about that. That's what he did with Don Kay's character Merlin, took him out of Greyhawk and transported him to an Old West scenario environment and then brought him back. So that's what he's talking about, despite the fact that there are very few similarities between the mechanics of Boot Hill and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So again, Boot Hill has no classes. It has no leveling to speak of. It has no saving throws. It has no hit points. The only similarities that it has at all are that you're randomly rolling dice to determine what your character's attributes are, but those attributes are completely different from the ones from Dungeons and Dragons. And weapons do variable amounts of damage. That's kind of really it. So there's really not a lot of similarities. So it's interesting that Gary writes this article to talk about how to move characters from one to the other. It's a fun idea. I was very intrigued by it as a kid, but we never did that. So so I think the other thing really that kind of did have an impact on the popularity of Boot Hill is that, again, we know that Don Kay was a big fan of Westerns, and it seems that Brian Bloom was as well, maybe to a lesser extent Gary Gygax, but I think it seems like, to me, Brian Bloom was the main person who was kind of pushing the agenda on getting Boot Hill published. I don't mean agenda in a bad way. It's just like it was kind of like his baby, it seemed like. And he'd been working on it with Don Kay. And it seems like, they had kind of grown up with these, they loved the Westerns as far as novels and books and also movies. But if you look at just the top TV shows from 1965, so I'm going to go 10 years before Boot Hill was published. In 1965, the top TV shows, there were 3 in the top 30, or maybe 4, I think it was, that are Westerns. So the number one show in 1965 was Bonanza, and it was on air forever. But you also had Gunsmoke in the top 30. You had The Virginian, and you had Wild Wild West. So move 10 years later, when this game's published, there are no Westerns on TV that are in the top 30 as far as ratings. And what you had were comedies mostly. And then, like MASH was on air, but you also had things like The Streets of San Francisco and The Bionic Woman and The $6 Million Man. So more of these like kind of adventure shows, but then very, very heavily like sitcom based. So public popularity had moved past the Western during this point. So, the Clint Eastwood spaghetti Westerns, those had already come and gone. And the Western really has, as a genre, has just not recovered. And it's, I think it's, few and far between. There have been some Western movies that have been made over the years, but not like consistently like what was happening in the 50s and 60s. And so I really think this game probably came a little late as far as kind of capitalizing on the popularity of the Western, and that really affected it as far as, its long-term legacy for role playing. Okay, that's it for Boot Hill. All right, now on to Tunnels and Trolls. So this is actually the third time I'm recording this part of the video because my on-screen recorder keeps crashing. So fingers crossed that third time's the charm. All right, so to talk about Tunnels and Trolls, the first thing we need to do is talk about a gentleman by the name of Ken St. Andre, which is, I believe, how his name is pronounced. That's what it looks like to me, so that's the pronunciation I'm going to use. If I'm wrong, go ahead and correct me in the comments. Nicely, please. Anyway, Ken St. Andre was born in 1947, and in the early 70s, he is a science fiction and fantasy fan. He's also a former war gamer, and sort of like an amateur game designer. And he ends up discovering the game of Dungeons and Dragons, hearing about it at the end of 1974. But he can't find the game. So he's in Scottsdale, Arizona at this time, outside of Phoenix. And as we recall, the game of Dungeons and Dragons is sort of created in that Midwest area between, Minneapolis with Dave Arneson and his crew, and then Lake Geneva with Gary Gygax and his crew. So that's where the game really was sort of concentrated. It does have distribution outside of that. We know the Aero Hobby folks out in Southern California in El Segundo in Santa Monica, as well as the We Warriors folks in El Segundo. They have access to Dungeons and Dragons in California. So the game was available. Scottsdale was probably just too small at the time to have a shop that stocked it. But in any event, Ken St. Andre eventually does get in touch with the game, gets a hold of the game in April 1975 when one of his gaming friends introduces him to the game. And so the short version of this is that he reads the game and has to figure out how to play it on his own because, again, there was no one around to teach them how to play, which is the best way to learn how to play Dungeons and Dragons. So he tries to read through the first 3 original brown rule booklets for Dungeons and Dragons. And if you've ever tried to learn how to play D&D without having a wargaming background, without having someone explain it to you, and then read those original 3 booklets, it would be very difficult to figure out what was going on and how to play. So, for whatever reason, Ken St. Andre reads that and he says, I want to make this simpler. I want to make it easier to understand. And so he does his version of Dungeons and Dragons, which ends up later on being called Tunnels and Trolls. Now, it's kind of transcended that original kind of derivative version of D&D, but that's really how it started out. This was a fan's look or a player's look at how to change the game to make it more suitable to their play style and to their group's play style. So that's a short version of this. We're going to get into more details on that later, such as like what are the changes that Ken made. But you see here, this says the Tunnels and Trolls. It says first edition reprint in 2013. This is, I have this as a PDF, and the original version of the game that Ken writes in April 1975, like the same month that he learns how to, play D&D. There were only 100 copies made that he typed up on his 1917 Remington typewriter. I believe he said it was 1917. And then he went and had it printed at, I think it was like a university print shop that he paid for. He paid for 100 copies of this game to be distributed or sold. He wanted to sell it. And so he that 100 copies, they're pretty much almost non-existent anymore as far as like finding them in the wild. They're very, very difficult to find, and because there were only 100 made. And one of the last ones that was in existence was Ken St. Andre's personal copy of those rules from 1975, and he offered it as a Kickstarter exclusive back to like the biggest backer, whatever it was, when they did a reprint of Tunnels and Trolls in the mid 2000s. And so this is a scan of his copy that he had to preserve it for posterity's sake. So everything in here is going to be exactly what was in that original version of the game from April of 1975, with the exception of this little note on the front that says first edition reprint. I believe the Tunnels and Trolls title at the top was also not listed on the game at the time. And then there's going to be a note from Ken St. Andre on the inside, just one page talking about this reprint. Other than that, it's the original version. All right, but let's talk about some of these other people that we see on here. So the next name that you see, it says Perpetuated on an Unsuspecting World by Ken St. Andre, Robin Carver. Now, Robin Carver is someone who met Ken St. Andre through science fiction groups and clubs that they were involved with. Also has a wargaming background, but he's the artist. So he's going to do all of the art for this particular version of edition of Tunnels and Trolls, with the exception of one picture, which we'll get to later. And also, my understanding is that it's Robin Carver who came up with the name for the game of Tunnels and Trolls. So what happened was when Ken made his version of D&D and changed it, when they played it in their group, they called it Dungeons and Dragons. That's just what they called it because that was the context that they had. But Ken was looking ahead to the future towards the commercial viability of this product. And so he knew he couldn't call it Dungeons and Dragons. And so the name he came up with was Tunnels and Troglodytes. And Robin Carver then said, no, I think Tunnels and Trolls, which is, it's quicker, it rolls off the tongue easier. It's just easier to say. So that's at least the version that I have seen, is that Robin Carver was the one that came up with the title. Now, as a kid, I never saw Tunnels and Trolls at the store. I only knew about it from articles in Dragon Magazine or ads in Dragon Magazine. And my gaming group wasn't interested in the game. And part of that was because we felt, or we thought, probably, incorrectly, I might add, we thought that Tunnels and Trolls was a game for kids. I associated it in my head for some reason with the game Bunnies and Burrows, which is a completely different game. It is a role-playing game, but I for whatever reason would sometimes conflate the two games because the names to me sounded one very derivative of Dungeons and Dragons, so I thought like that meant that they were lesser products. So I do think that the name of the game Tunnels and Trolls, while maybe people have a fondness for it now or nostalgia for it, I think it may have held the game back from maybe gaining a little bit of a bigger fan base had it had a different name, just because it seems like what it's trying to do is be a derivative version of Dungeons and Dragons. And like I said, I think the game by this point has transcended that original vision, but at the time, that's what we thought. So in any event, that's Robin Carver. Now, Mark Anthony, the next name that you see here, the only thing I can find about Mark is that he was a member of Ken St. Andre's gaming circle, and they played the game together. They kind of ended up playtesting it together. And I know from looking at Ken St. Andrew's blog that he and Mark Anthony were still in touch um, as recently as just a few years ago. He wrote a blog post about going to the Magic Castle here in Los Angeles, and he has pictures of him with Mark Anthony. But as far as like what did Mark Anthony do career-wise, if anything, within the role-playing game field, I can't find any information on that. So if you know, drop it in the comments. James Peters, they also call him Bear in quotes. So he is another player in this campaign, or play testing this game at the time. So one of the things that he ends up doing is having a career for a little bit, at least, in the role-playing game field by writing supplements for Tunnels and Trolls, but he also writes some kind of like generic role-playing game books, such as the City books. Okay, so that is those individuals. So let's dive in and jump a little bit more into this. So you see the introduction over here, this new preface by Ken St. Andre in 2013 for this edition. I'm not going to read through that. I'm going to jump over here to the second page on the right, where you immediately get the sense that we're looking at a game that's going to have a sense of humor, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we have contents, and then it says underneath, and malcontents. So I always thought that was kind of funny once I first saw this. So it just right away you get the sense of what kind of game you're looking at here. And then if you go down about halfway through this table of contents on page 19, you'll see elaborations, and then in parentheses, and portrait of naked Amazon. So I think that is probably a little bit of a jab at the original edition of Dungeons and Dragons. In one of the books, there was an illustration of a naked Amazon. And it's because, at the time, these guys, it's partly coming out of the inspirational fiction, but partly it was because it was almost exclusively a young male audience, college aged, coming out of the wargaming field. So that would have been something that would have been appropriate for that, I guess, at the time. So anyway, I just thought that was funny that he points it out in the table of contents to like grab your attention right away. All right, and then you see it says Principles and Precepts by Ken St. Andre with a little help from his friends. So we've talked about a few of these, and then it says the other art is artist by Robin Carver, except for the Mad Obbit by Dan Carver. So Dan Carver is Robin Carver's brother, and they used to call him let me see here, if Ugly John Carver. I don't know where the John comes from, but that's kind of like where they used to, that was his nickname for a little bit. So he ends up creating later on a logo, the Trollhead logo, that's associated with Tunnels and Trolls. And he does work on a series of supplements that they called Uncle Ugly's Underground, that was related to Tunnels and Trolls. And then he does end up having actually a career more in like the computer game design field. So that's Dan Carver. And then you see it talks about layout with help from Mark Anthony. We've already talked about him. And then it says the legendary and justifiably infamous first edition. So I'm not going to go through this in terms of being a review. This is not a review of Tunnels and Trolls because, just to be quite blunt, I've never played Tunnels and Trolls. One of my good friends on Twitter, or X, whatever, is William W. Connors, who's a former game designer at TSR. He loves Tunnels and Trolls, and he's always talking to me about it, which is great because I learned a lot of things from him about it. But what I'm going to do in here is kind of like what I've been doing with the other games is to discuss sort of the people that were involved, which we're talking about that right now, but then also some of the mechanics and how they differed from Dungeons and Dragons, because especially with this game, this was specifically made to be an easier to use Dungeons and Dragons. That's kind of how he really thinks about it. And so I want to talk about some of those game concepts, those mechanics, because they are going to start to influence other game design in the future. And then also talk a little bit about the legacy of Tunnels and Trolls in terms of the entire role playing game, field, the category into the future. So that's sort of where I'm going to focus. So I hope I don't go through this too fast, but leave a comment if you want more details. All right. So uh, what he starts out with here on the left hand page is the basic game, and he kind of just says you don't have to understand the concept, and he says imagine it's an alternate world where fantasy is alive and magic works. So a world somewhat but not exactly similar to Tolkien's Middle Earth. So he's name dropping things, which is fine. That's what they did back then. And there's, enchanted tunnel concepts, there's things like that. So he kind of explains that in the first paragraph. Where I really start to like this is in the second paragraph. So you see a few things here. It says, in order to play the game, it's necessary to do the following things first. Someone must create, and then parentheses, dig, and stock a dungeon with monsters, magic, and treasure. So I love that use of the word dig. It's something that I've never really seen anywhere else other than Tunnels and Trolls. I don't know if other places use this, but I like it because it's working on different levels, right? It's one of the things is, this is of the time when this is written. Dig was, you'd say like, oh, I dig that. Like, you'll see me say it sometimes on social media. I'll forget that people don't talk that one anymore. I go, oh, I really dig the way this looks or whatever. And so I think that it's kind of working on sort of different, pardon the pun here, because we're talking about dungeons, different levels. But like, I think that maybe he's using dig to be that kind of like it's hip or it's cool. Like I like this, but also you have to create it from scratch, and you're digging out the dungeon. So I could be overthinking it, but there you go. And then the other one, it says here, if you keep reading in that section, it says the Dungeon Master DM. Now, I think if I remember reading this correctly, and I should have confirmed before we got on the video, but my understanding is this is the first time that we see the word Dungeon Master used, and it's not in Dungeons and Dragons. In original D&D, they don't use the term. It's called a referee or a judge. So we're seeing this term here, and it's funny that it's now, I think, believed trademarked by Wizards of the Coast, or probably by TSR before that. But I think this is one of, if not the first time that we see the use of the term Dungeon Master. And then you have to create and name your characters. We're going to explore it. And it kind of goes through that. And then it says the game is played something like Battleship, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. The idea is that you've got a board or a world or a dungeon or a map, whatever term you're going to use, that the players actually can't see. And they're making decisions based on not being able to see that board. And then someone, which is the DM, is going to tell them what happens. Another thing that they use here, he says, one of the players known as the voicer or the group leader. Now, later on in the text of this edition, he's going to call that person a caller, which is what they were called at Dungeons and Dragons. But here he calls it a voicer, which is a cumbersome term. Caller is easier. But whatever. So that's how people used to play back in the day, when you had a lot of players. Rather than the DM trying to listen to them all at once and figure out what they were doing, the group would come to a consensus and tell the DM, this is what we are doing. Right. So that person was called the caller. I know we don't play that way anymore, but it was very common at the time. All right. Now, over here on the right-hand page, he's getting a little bit into the history of why he made this game, which I think is fun because, again, it's important to understand why this game was created and why he's doing what he did and the decisions that he made. So he talks about, trying to learn how to play D&D. And he says, after several hours of examination of those rules, I reached the following two conclusions. One, $10 was too much to pay for 3 little books of rules. So I looked it up in an inflation calculator, and $10 in 1974 money, which is when D&D was published, would be worth, I think it's $62.56 today in 2024. So that's a pretty hefty level of inflation. And if you look at it, would you want to pay $60 or $62 of today money for a small digest-sized box with 3 digest-sized books? Probably not. That is a little pricey. Now, sometimes on Kickstarter, prices can get that high, but that's a different beast, a different animal. Okay. So that was too much. And then he said, two, the game could be simplified and changed in concept to retain the best parts of the original ideas with better ideas substituted for the things I just didn't like about D&D. So he says flat out, he's changing this because there's things in the game that he didn't like. We're going to go through what some of those things are. So he spends the next day writing, but he gets it out really quickly. And he talks about here how he worked with Mark Anthony and James Bear Peters, and then Greg Brown is another name on here, another individual I can't find too much information on other than he was part of this game group, but he's the one later on he's going to talk about that had suggested that wandering monsters should have treasure. That was one of the things that Greg Brown was known for as far as this particular group of rules. So, and then he goes on to say, so it's no longer Dungeons and Dragons, it's now Tunnels and Trolls. So he thanks Gary and Dave for creating D&D, but basically says this is its own thing now. And he thanks his group. He thanks Steve McAllister, who's another person, and that I can't really find a lot of information about. So I think it was just part of his playtest group. Um, and then he kind of says, happy hunting and deep delving. So what happened as far as like, where does this fall in terms of our publication of like what counts as the second role-playing game? Well, Ken St. Andre self-publishes, 100 copies, and he tries to sell some. He ends up taking 10 of them or selling 10 of them at a very small game convention in early July. So he has it ready to go in April, and I think starts selling it to his friends and maybe like local people if there was a gaming community there. He's selling some copies to them, self-published, right? And then he takes some copies and sells them at a very small local game not local to him, but a small game convention in early July. But then the big break is that he gives 40 copies of the game to a man named Rick Loomis, who was the owner of a company called Flying Buffalo Games, which was primarily a play-by-mail game company. They had other non-play-by-mail games, but they really kind of were known for, especially later on, known for the play-by-mail games, which is a whole industry. If you need more information on that, ask in the comments. So he gives it to Rick Loomis and says, hey, can you sell these at Origins 1975 in July? And Origins, huge game convention, at the time kind of competing with Gen Con as far as like which one's going to be bigger. And so Rick is like, sure, and he puts it on the corner of his desk, and he's thinking at the table, at the convention, and he's thinking no one's going to buy this. Like, it's a game without a board. There's no winner. Like, I don't get it. The concept of role playing games and how influential they were going to be was just not on anyone's radar. Nobody could really tell how Dungeons and Dragons was going to change the gaming world. So he puts them there thinking nothing of it, and he sells all 40 copies. And then after that, he realizes like, hey, I think we've got something here. Makes a deal with Ken St. Andre to be the distributor and publisher of Tunnels and Trolls through Flying Buffalo. But very unique at the time, Ken St. Andre retains the rights, the ownership to the game. So he's sort of like licensing it to Flying Buffalo to produce. And they end up publishing Tunnels and Trolls all the way through until the end of the company, which sadly was in 2021. So Rick Loomis died in 2019. The company continued for a little while without him, but then it finally had to end up closing up shop. And so, but up until that point, they were still making editions and working with people to publish editions of Tunnels and Trolls. So again, we get into this terminology. When was this game published? Ken St. Andre has copies available for sale in April and in May of 1975, but that's not commercially available. I wouldn't call it that. And so he takes it where it really makes its main debut at Origins, which is also where En Garde and Empire of the Petal Throne make their main debut in 1975 at Origins. So there's some information that says maybe Empire of the Petal Throne was sold commercially a little bit before Origins, and we know that Tunnels and Trolls was sold at another game convention prior to Origins. But that's why it's very confusing to say which game was the second role-playing game published. And it's, I guess the easy one out is to say Boot Hill, but, we've talked about that already. All right, so that's kind of where this game fits into the history. So let's get into what are some differences? What are we going to see here in this game of Tunnels and Trolls? Well, he talks about digging the dungeon, and you need graph paper, pencil, and pen, scratch paper, and lined paper for writing. And so then I really like this. He says, sit down and think about what theme you want for your dungeon. What's your inspiration? And so he says one DM who's Bear, that's James Peters, has for a general theme cave bears and magical metamorphoses. And he talks about how that dungeon looks in contrast to another DM that he works with who is focused on serpents and riddling rhymes. And so I think that's a really fun way to look at it. And I like this I like this tone. I like his conversational tone. And one of the things that I really like that he does throughout these rules is that he talks about the people that he worked with on the game to come up with these concepts, and he names them in the game. So very, very different from the style of writing that you see in Dungeons and Dragons, which was much drier, and it sometimes comes across that Gary was the sole person in charge of that game. We know that he wasn't, and he does at certain times in certain places name other people that were involved, but Ken St. Andre does it throughout this rules document. He's saying, "Oh, this rule came from this guy. This idea came from this person. Like, I like how this person stocks their dungeons." So I really like that conversational tone. As you can tell, that's kind of how I do my videos. I don't have scripts, so if you haven't figured that out by now, so that's why I this is very appealing to me. This very kind of style of talking. All right, so he talks a little bit about that. And then on the next page over here, he talks about how to create a character. And then he says, here's the general form. You can use an index card, which I love that idea because I like having everything fit on a single little place where I can find it right away, as opposed to like, an 8-page document for my character. But anyway, we're going to see here are attributes for our characters: strength, intelligence, luck, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. So he swapped out the D&D attribute of wisdom for luck. And there's a very specific reason for this, and it's because in original Dungeons and Dragons, when it talks about the ability scores, and you'll want to watch my video on the history of 6 ability scores in D&D and why we have those to learn a little bit more about this. But it basically says that intelligence and wisdom are almost interchangeable. It kind of says they're like the same thing, and the only reason you had 2 was because they were the prime requisites for 2 different classes. Clerics were wisdom, and magic users were intelligence. So Ken St. Andre doesn't like that, and I read a quote in another book where he basically says that like he thought that was redundant, and so he's swapping wisdom for luck because to his mind, there was no reason to have intelligence and wisdom. So he has both of those. And then you see here, he's got type. That's a class. We'll get that in a second. And then you've got your experience points, your weapons, your armor, your languages. So all that fits on the card. He talks about the prime attributes. How you determine them is by rolling 3 dice. So very important here. He doesn't say 3 6-sided dice. That's because this game only uses 6-sided dice. That was one of the things that Ken St. Andre wanted to change about Dungeons and Dragons. He thought that having all those different kinds of dice made the game more expensive, made it harder to get into. They were hard to acquire. They weren't available everywhere. So why wouldn't you just use dice that are easy to come by that everybody probably already has? So this game uses 6-sided dice. But the assumption is when he says 3 dice, you know exactly what he means, because you wouldn't be thinking that that's a 20-sided die because you probably don't even know what that is. So you're going to roll 3 dice. So you're going to generate a score from 3 to 18, just like you would in Dungeons and Dragons. And then he says, write it down in pencil, for they are variable. Very important point to this game. Unlike Dungeons and Dragons, this game makes a change, which is that your ability scores are going to change over the course of your character's life. Unlike an original D&D, where your ability scores pretty much would never change after character creation, except by magic. That was really the only thing that might change it. In this game, they're going to change constantly. Okay, so he goes through that. You're going to figure out your goal. He talks about weight limits and things like that. But, I'm trying to just focus on the things that are different from D&D. He's got experience points. He explains that. Weapons or armor are self-explanatory, he says. Okay. And then he's got languages. There's a common tongue, just like there is in D&D. He's got a common tongue here, but there's also tongues for other races like dragons and trolls and things like that. Now, it's this type of character. This is going to be what we call a class. And he says there's 3 types: warrior, magic user, and rogue. So first off, I like the use of the word rogue there because we didn't start using that in D&D. That term wasn't common in D&D until 3rd edition in the year like 2000, 2001 when that came out. So this is 25 years before that, and he's using the word rogue. So I think this is the first game that uses rogue as a term for character class. However, this is not a replacement for the thief class from D&D. It's not the 3rd edition or 5th edition style rogue. And that's because when he was working on this game in April of 1975, he wouldn't have seen the thief class because that had was barely just being published in Greyhawk Supplement 1. He had such a hard time getting hold of the original edition of D&D, I think it's highly unlikely that he had seen the thief class. So he's creating this thing called the rogue, and then he says that the warrior, magic user, and rogue are modeled respectively after Conan, Gandalf, and Cudgel the Clever. So of those three, the one you probably don't know is Cudgel the Clever. That is the protagonist slash hero, anti-hero, however you want to call it, from the Jack Vance stories, the Dying Earth stories. If you've watched my video on the D&D magic system, you know that Jack Vance's stories were extremely influential in how D&D interpreted magic. And in this particular case, Ken St. Andre is using one of the characters from those stories, from those Dying Earth stories by Jack Vance, as a model for this rogue class, which is really a combination of thief and rogue, or it's like a scoundrel and a wizard. That's really what that is. It's not a straight up thief. He doesn't have clerics. He doesn't want clerics. He's quoted later on, and I read this in the book called Designers and Dragons by Shannon Appelkline. So his quote was something to the effect of, there weren't any clerics because he didn't want the game being, quote, dominated by some pseudo-Christian religion, unquote. So there's no clerics, and so the replacement of that, and the cleric is essentially a fighter magic user. That's what it is. So the rogue fills that role, but he's modeling it after a different, archetype, a different character from stories. All right, so that's what that's about. Then he talks about, if your strength is high, you should be a warrior. You don't have to, but that's what we'd recommend. So luck would be the score that you want to have if you want to be a rogue. That's the score that you'd want to have as your highest. And then it talks a little bit about how magic users cast spells. That's in this particular section here. So he talks about casting spells requires an IQ of a certain level, and it also requires a minimum dexterity to cast magic spells, and it depletes your character's strength. So that's a difference again. Even though we're just talking about Jack Vance, this game does not use the D&D magic system. So for one thing, spell level in this game is equal to character level. So a third level magic user casts third level spells. Eighth level magic user casts eighth level spells. So that's one thing. But the other thing is it doesn't rely on the Vancian magic system, the memorize and then fire and then forget. It doesn't work that way. Spells in this case are fueled by your strength, and your strength score is going to go down as you cast spells. So in a way, it's a very kind of like primitive early version of like a spell point system, essentially. And this is the first game that does something like that. So again, we're already starting to see things that are going to be affecting game design for decades to come in this very early derivative version of a simpler Dungeons and Dragons. All right. So that's that. Going over here to the page 8 on the right, we see monster making. So very interesting thing with this particular book. There are no monsters in this book as far as like stats and how to run them. He basically says, here's how you make monsters. You think of what you want, and you see this this big paragraph here. He says, in my game, we have fire-breathing dragons, crocodiles, unicorns, sharks, or snarks and boojums, black hobbits, giant spiders, cave lions, pythons, centaurs, toothy, non-flammable dragons, werewolves, balrogs, basilisks, goes on and on and on, right? That whole paragraph is just a list of all the monsters that he puts in his campaign. And then basically he says, well, to design a monster, you have to kind of give it a rating on between 26 and 40 of like, that's what a good monster would be facing against a good fighter type in the game. So, but a puny monster like a rat or a dog is going to have a rating below 30. And so, but like, he doesn't really tell you anything about like how to design, monster abilities, anything like that. That's not in here. So the monster section takes up that page and the top of this next page on the left, and we're done. That's it for monsters. Then we're going to go to combat, and he talks about how combat works. So, interestingly, in this game, the combat system works whether it's individual versus individual or whether it's group versus group. The system is exactly the same. So, if it's group versus group, you're going to compare one score for the totals of your group to the one score for the totals of the other group. It's a very interesting system, very stripped down, like I said. In this particular game, armor is going to absorb damage, not make it harder to be hit. So I know a lot of people hate that in D&D, that armor makes it harder to be hit. They think it doesn't make sense.
I don't care that it doesn't, make sense because it's a game. It's not intended to be realistic. The combat system and the entire mechanics behind D&D are intended to be abstract, but this is a case where I could see as being a younger person and looking at this, it could be a little hard to wrap your head around. Why does having heavy, bulky armor make it harder for me to be hit as opposed to absorbing the damage that's coming in? So that's what this system does. So if you're into that and you want a rules light system that could work with D&D, you might want to look to this for ideas on arm absorption if you haven't done that already. All right, so then he talks about monster reactions, which are right out of D&D, that 2d6 roll to generate a curve from 2 to 12 on, how are the monsters going to react when you're fighting. He talks about wandering monsters here. He says wandering monsters are just what they sound like, either alone or in groups who just wander around the dungeon looking for excitement. I don't agree with that interpretation of wandering monsters. I think they're people that live there that happen to be out and about as opposed to camping in a room waiting to be killed by adventurers. But I guess it's just in semantics. So it's just how you look at it. And so he talks about that. All right. So let's move on. This is your combat system. So it's conducted by comparing hit point totals at yours against theirs. The hit point total is the sum of a character's die roll plus whatever adds may be coming to him. And it talks about adds later on. So when fighting with groups, individual sums are accumulated to form a group score. All right. And then one of the interesting things with magic users that he says is that magic users are always hit last in combat. That's sort of their way of surviving because they're not as strong as the other character types. Their strength is probably lower and they are losing strength because they are, casting spells. Now, the other thing that's interesting in this game where it says hit point totals, they're not talking about hit points like D&D. In this particular game, when you're wounded, you subtract scores from your constitution score. And when your constitution score reaches 0, you are dead. So there's no hit points, there's constitution. All right. So that's another reason why it's so important that these ability scores are changing throughout the course of the game. They're not going to stay flat. You want to gain more constitution so that you can take more damage in combat. So he talks about that a little bit, and then he gives a very specific example of magic users being hit last. So he says if there's a group with 2 warriors and a magic user, and they're sharing 8 hits between the 3 characters from the other side, then the 2 warrior types are each going to take 3 hits, and the magic user is only going to take 2 hits. It's not determined randomly. The magic user is only going to take 2 because they are a magic user and they get hit last. So he talks about that, and then goes on to saving rolls, which are kind of like saving throws, but not really. They're slightly different, but I think the concept is the same. The execution's different. I'm not going to belabor that one too much. Then he talks about experience points and how to get experience points. And what I like about this is he says there are many ways to pile up experience points. These are the ones I've thought of. So he's telling you straight out, this is just how I do it. You do it how you want. This is how I do it. So one of the things that he does in this is he gives points for combat, for treasure, but only treasure that's brought out of the dungeon safely. For daring. So basically, just going into a dungeon, if you return to the surface alive, you get 100 points of experience times the deepest level of the dungeon that you were in. This game is all about dungeon delving. It's not about wilderness exploration or anything like that. It's going into a dungeon, mucking around, seeing what you can find, and getting out alive. And then you're going to get points for having done that. He gives points for just using magic because it's dangerous to do so because you're losing strength when you do it, for finding magic, and then for making saving rolls and surviving. So that's his system of experience points. Then he talks about here an experience points chart. Now, this is also very unique at the time. In Dungeons and Dragons, as a comparison, each class had a different experience point table based on how powerful that class was. So magic users had, it took more experience to go up to the next level. Fighters were in the middle, and clerics had the least. And then when the thief class came along, it was even lower than cleric. And the idea was thieves don't get a lot. They're not as powerful. So by compensation, it takes fewer experience points to get up to the next level so that you can start accumulating more goodies quicker than if you're a magic user, where you're going to get these really cool spells when you go up in level. And so as a consequence, you're going to spend more experience points to get there. In this game, he flattens it out because one of the key design elements of this particular game, Tunnels and Trolls, is Ken doesn't want you looking at tables during the game, experience points tables and combat matrices and saving throw tables and all that. He doesn't want to do any of that. So he's doing everything he can to make it easy for you to not have to refer to a table. So every class in this game gets the same experience point table. He's got some fun level titles here. He doesn't call them level titles, but that's what they are essentially. I particularly like the ones for the rogue because they're very evocative. Drunk rollers and con artists, silver tongue devils, things like that. I think those are really fun. Okay, so then he says if anyone ever gets more than 1,000,000 experience points, you let that person decide what the higher levels are up from there. They get to figure that out. And then this is what you get when you go up in level. So this is where your attributes are going to change. Each time a character advances to a higher level, he or she has the following options. Choose only one. Add the new level to the number of the strength factor. Add half of the new level to your intelligence. Twice the new level to your luck. Like, you have these choices, right? This is how your scores are going to change. And they're going to change a lot. They're going to change a lot, right? So that's going to be happening during the course of the game. Every level, you're going to be doing that. So then he talks about supplies and provisions. This is your equipment page, essentially. And then he gets into weapons and armor and explains what they are and how to use them. This is all very basic stuff. He talks about human auxiliaries. These are basically like your hirelings that you're going to have, like, to go into a dungeon. All right. Here's your nude Amazon that they talked about earlier in the elaboration section. This is sort of like, you can almost think of it as like advanced rules in a way. So it says the Peter McAllister chart for creating man-like characters and monsters. So again, he's name dropping people from his group. Peters and McAllister, so two different people. Sorry, from his group, he's name dropping them, and I think that's really cool that he did that. That he's saying this idea came from these people in my group. So this is where you can figure out if you want to play a dwarf, elf, leprechaun, fairy, or hobbit. They used the term hobbit back then, just like in Dungeons and Dragons, until they had to stop. Talks about giants, trolls, ogres, that kind of thing. But this is essentially telling you how to create characters like that. This talks about the logic of magic, which is just a kind of a goofy little article, but it gives you a little bit of details on the mechanics, but it's basically just kind of like an overview of how magic works in the world. But then we're going to get into our spell descriptions. So right away, again, we're going to see the tongue-in-cheek tone of this game. So you have spells like Lock Tight, or Oh, There It Is, Hidey Hole, Take That, You Fiend, Oh, Go Away. So a lot of people hated that. They didn't like these spelled because they just thought that it wasn't serious enough. I think it's a fun product of its time. I think it's cool, to kind of have a different game. They didn't want to just copy what Dungeons and Dragons was doing, and having spells with names like that help you to tell right away what does that spell do. So, yeah, this is, I mean, you can see the spells here, but it just goes on and on. You've got your 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th level spells. Okay. So all the way up to level 17, which is kind of how this game sort of tops out a little bit. And then it talks about how to make new spells and how that would work. And then you've got your advanced weapons chart. So this is just adding more. It's just adding more and more weapons. So one of the interesting things I kind of skirted past earlier, but in the combat section, it talks about how to do damage. And in so it says one of the characters might be fighting with fisticuffs, like with their body, I think it says with your body. But then it says another character might have a submachine gun, and it tells you how many points of damage it would do. Submachine guns aren't listed back here, but just the fact that that was mentioned in a write-up of how to adjudicate combat, I thought was an interesting way to look at it. So he's got all these different things here. He's got all these different pull weapons, so that's a very Gygaxian thing to do, to have different types of pull arms that all do slightly different things. This fun illustration here of this poor guy with all these different weapons stuck into them, so we can see what the different weapons are. It goes over bows and missile weapons and shields, and then he's got his weird weapons table here, which is also kind of new for the time. Other games didn't have that. It's got poisons, armor, weapon composition, and then he gets into this whole section on berserker fighting. It's a little cumbersome, but it's basically like you can go berserk and do more damage, is essentially what it is, and monsters can do it as well. Then he's got this advice for dungeon masters, which is almost written as like a poem. It's cute. You can see it here. I'm not going to read through it. And then you've got this illustration here. So this is the illustration that was done by Robin Carver's brother Dan. This is the Mad Hobbit, it says, and there's a description there. And that's going to be it for Tunnels and Trolls. Now, Tunnels and Trolls ends up being having several different editions. So there's already a second edition of Tunnels and Trolls by the end of 1975. And then, third, fourth, fifth editions, they go on and on and on into the 80s and 90s. And the thing is, they're very, very compatible. Unlike D&D, where there's a fundamental shift between second and third edition as far as how to play, and then between third and fourth, and then between fourth and fifth. Tunnels and Trolls, much like Call of Cthulhu, the editions are very, very compatible, very similar to each other. It's sort of just like refining, cleaning up, maybe expanding, but not really changing the rules. So the last edition they published, I want to say it was the eighth one. They call it the eighth, but it was really like an anniversary edition. Very fancy. That was the one that was on Kickstarter, where Ken St. Andre gave out his last remaining copy of the original first edition, printed in this, from his typewriter. So that was, I think, roughly 10 years ago, I guess. So that wouldn't have been the 50th. I guess it was the 40th. So in any event, we're now coming up on the 50th anniversary of this game next year. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a new edition come out. I sure hope so. I hope that this game stays alive, because I think that it's a fun alternative to D&D. I know there's a sizable group of people that still enjoy playing it. And even if you don't play the game, this is a great artifact of the era of early, changes to game design from the existing big game. And that is going to wrap up our look at Tunnels and Trolls. Okay, our third game that we're going to talk about, going to do this one pretty briefly, is En Garde. This is by Game Designers Workshop. So really quickly to discuss Game Designers Workshop, they were an existing game company, started in 1972, so they predate the publication of D&D, mainly doing, war games. That's kind of what they were known for. So a company started by a gentleman by the name of Mark, with a C, Miller. Not to be confused with the Mark Miller from comics, who I believe spells his last name A.R. This is Mark Miller with a C, but Miller spelled E.R. at the end. So names can get confusing when you're just listening to them and you're not seeing them written down. So started at Illinois State University, and was in a game club with a man named Frank Chadwick, who's going to be important later, and Rich Banner. And they started this game group. They were publishing some games, or trying to, and working with like educational games, things like that. They had some World War II style war games, but we're going to just skip forward to the part that's important to us, which is when they discover the game of Dungeons and Dragons. So they had done, as Mark Miller, I think specifically, had done some limited role playing when he was in poli sci class in college, and that was very common at the time, and I think it's still common now. You don't think of it necessarily as being role playing, but that's what it is. It's doing exercises with politics and political science. I did it when I was in middle school, even without realizing that that's what we were doing. They would give you a scenario like World War I, and you would have to figure out, like, how do I get allies with these other countries and all that kind of thing, and then what's going to happen based on the decisions that we made and the alliances that we made. So that's a form of role playing. So they kind of were used to the concept. They got the concept, right? But they discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and they decided that they want to get into that field, that which again at the time wasn't called a role-playing game field, but they knew it was a new genre. They were able to kind of pick up on that. So they decide to publish this swashbuckling game called En Garde, which is sort of a hybrid, just like Boot Hill. This is a hybrid of like a war game, strategy game, mixed with a little bit of role-playing. So it's a combat simulation forming the core of this particular game. So its main developer on this game is a gentleman by the name of Frank Chadwick. So a very long storied history in game design, most of it for Game Designers Workshop, but about 2 years after he works on Garde, he's going to work with Mark Miller on Traveler. So huge game. But then he's also going to work on Twilight 2000. And then one of the games I think, other than Traveler, one of the games I think that he's best known for, I would say, would be Space 1889, which was sort of an early steampunk game before steampunk was even a term that people used. So again, long and storied history in game design. but this was one of his first. I think no, it was his first role playing game, because it's in consideration as being one of the very first games published for role playing after Dungeons and Dragons. So this is on Garde, and pardon me for a second while I make it easier to scroll through this. I meant to do that before we got onto the recording here. All right, so we have the introduction here, and it says it's a semi-historical game simulation representing many of the situations in of an Errol Flynn movie in the 17th and 18th century, blah, blah, blah. So it goes on, and then it gives you sort of the character types. It's Cyrano, Roxanne, and Scaramouche, and Errol Flynn, and Porthos, and Athos. Like, all the Three Musketeers are in here. Constance and D'Artagnan, and the Cardinal's Guard, and all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of like they're setting up sort of the theme of the game that we're going to be looking at here. So again, first distributed for public distribution and sale at Origins 1975, end of July, along with, again, part of the Petal Throne and Tunnels and Trolls. So they're all kind of there together. So he says it's dedicated to Alexander Dumas. We all know who that is. A famous writer, okay? Man in the Iron Mask, so many more. So Danny Kaye was in a movie, and I just forgot the name of it. I had looked this up earlier, but he was in a movie very early on where it's a comedy movie, but it's a period piece, and he ends up having a very famous on-screen fencing battle with a gentleman, and I've also just forgot. I'm going to put these up on the screen for you because I had looked this up. I should have written it down in my notes. I thought I would remember. But a very famous, movie fencing person who was like known for doing fencing scenes in movies. An actor, and that was the last on-screen appearance of him fencing was in this movie with Danny Kaye. So I believe that's why they're mentioning Danny Kaye here. And then Sir Harry Flashman, who is a fictional character, but from a famous list of stories, famous for the time, of sort of like this swashbuckling adventure type character. So it just jumps right in. There's really, other than this really short introduction that tells you that it's a game that you're going to be playing, but it just jumps right into you're going to be playing characters that are going to duel. So like in Boot Hill, where your duels are gunfights for the most part, your duels here are going to be sword fights. So you get these italicized words. These are essentially going to be your ability scores: strength, expertise, constitution, and endurance. Very interesting to me that they separate constitution and endurance because they're synonyms, but that's fine. So it uses a series of 12 turn sequences. So I'm not going to get into the weeds in this one either, but essentially what this does is players write down what they're going to do on their turn through a series of what are called routines. It's sort of like I'm parrying, I'm running, I'm fighting, like whatever. They write it down, another player writes it down, and then the referee helps adjudicate like the order of how things happen based on the character's expertise. The higher expertise gets to go first, right? It's very detailed for what it's more detailed than it needs to be for what it is. I'll just put it that way. So, but it's interesting. Then it talks about recovery and swordsmanship and optional routines. It gives you all this stuff, breaking your weapons, optional. Okay, so here's what's interesting. This is one of the first games that gets into this idea of your character's social level based on their birth and how that's going to be important during the course of play. Not really addressed in original Dungeons & Dragons. It's heavily addressed in the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. There is social aspects to Empire of the Petal Throne, but this is really the first game where it kind of comes out and tells you, like, it is important to understand your social rank and who your parents were and who your siblings are and all that kind of stuff. And there's mechanics for dealing with that in this particular game. So you've got your status points, your social level, your clubs that you're going to join. And then it talks about the time sequence here. So it says you have to adhere to a strict time schedule of events, with each player being responsible for maintaining his own personal calendar, showing his actions each week and any changes in social level, status points, or wealth. So that's a huge part of this game, is tracking this stuff over time. And the basic unit of time is a week. 4 weeks make up a month, and 3 months make up a season, and 4 seasons make up a year. So that's all going to be important later. But for each week of the game, each players have to figure out what their actions are for that week. And so it gives you an example where the April of 1607 and a sample 3 month for 3 characters might be Porthos is going to go to hunters with Falstaff, going to practice with his rapier. He's going to join the Royal Footman Regiment as a captain. So all these things are going to give you status points for doing these particular things, excelling at these particular things. And that's important because you have to have status points at the end of tracking. And if you fall below a certain status level, like your rank goes down, it's like this whole game within a game just to track your status that really doesn't rely on die rolls. It's just purely, you said you were going to do these things, you're going to stack up your points and figure out how that works. So it's like I said, it's probably more complicated than it needs to be, but it is interesting in the standpoint, again, we're going to see in the future, especially in the 90s, these games start to become popular, and then they're even more popular, I would say, now. Games that are all about social aspects of your character and not about combat. This game is really focused on combat, but it dedicates a huge part of it to the social aspect. So it talks about carousing and female companionship. So this game is very much assuming that you are going to be playing a male character that wants to carouse with female characters. I'm just going to say that straight up. So it's very much a product of its time, and you get points for doing that. And if you don't do that, you lose points. So you have to do that. So it says, and then it talks about gambling. So you can gamble at clubs or bawdy houses. I think that's interesting because, again, we've talked about there was gambling rules in some of the other games that we were looking at, like Boot Hill. There's gambling rules in here, and they're, of course, completely different. But it's interesting that they both address it. So this page was repeated in here for some reason. I don't know why. I guess it was just a bad scan of this game that I got. So then you've got loans and toadying and bawdy houses and dueling and practice and regiments. So all these things are going to give you points to your status at the end of your tracking period. All right. It talks about the regimental organization and what the different ranks are within that. And then it talks about frontier regiments. And then you've got your Royal North Highland Border regiments, all these different things, very military focused. Okay. So you see all that there. I know I'm going through this quick, and it's because, again, I'm trying to look for things that like stick out from D&D, and the thing is, this game mostly just does that. It's not D&D like at all. But I really, my focus was not to talk about the mechanics that much unless I was comparing it to something from D&D. So you have your promotion, all this kind of stuff. Reckless bravery. It talks a little bit about non-player characters. Rank in the military again, and then it gets into being appointed, your titles, how you can get a title, which is, again, is going to help your status. Disgrace, investment. So you can see the first part of the game is very combat focused. This part of the game, again, very social focused. Some fun artwork here. And then you've got all these tables to refer to for your dueling tables. So dueling table A, dueling table B, dueling table C, then your birth tables. So look how many of these there are, and your father's position, and gentleman, nobleman. Okay. And then you've got your birth table D. What was your father's title? Your initial social level, your mistress courting. What social level are they? And how is it different from you? How many points do you get for socializing with them for being of a different social rank? And you've got your regiment table. And there's 2 of those. Your list of brigades, friends, enemies, and weapons. And then it has social level and influence tables and force commitment, like just all tables. That's the rest of this game, is essentially all tables. It talks about notes on military and government appointment tables. And then your inspector general of infantry. Like, look at the detail here. It's very interesting. I'll just put it that way. So that's going to be it for this game. Again, I know this is quick. So where does this game kind of fall within the legacy? Like, what's important here? Well, the game, it does get a second edition printed in 77, I think it was. Just not that popular. So it does print the game again, but it doesn't end up really selling all that well. And they were thinking about moving it to sort of like a different concept, maybe like a play by mail kind of thing that didn't really work out. So the game kind of just falls by the wayside. But it really doesn't matter because, like I said, 2 years after this, um, uh, Frank is going to work with Mark Miller and design Traveler, which ends up being like the big daddy over at Game Designers Workshop for a huge part of its lifetime of the company. And so that kind of like takes the forefront. So, and when that happens, this game kind of just falls away. My understanding from the time I didn't even heard of this game until I started doing research on early games in the role-playing game history. I had forgotten about it because I had read about it in the Heroic Worlds book. I've shown that before on the channel. There's just a tiny little snippet, but I kind of just breezed past it because there wasn't a lot of detail there. But my understanding is that people liked the setting. So this is one of the first games, again, that's going to move beyond a fantasy style setting and move into something different. But they didn't like the mechanics necessarily. And as you saw here, you can probably see why. So again, such an early game where they're trying to figure out like, what are the things that people like about these types of games? And, there's really no like experience point system in here, that level of advancement. There's no classes, there's no skills. So I think the big thing to come out of this is this idea of tracking your social rank and how that's going to affect your gameplay from session to session based on what rank you are and how people are perceiving your actions. And that part of the concept is still part of a lot of role-playing games today. And this is really, I think, the first place where you see that. So just for that alone, I think it deserves a mention, as well as for the different and unique setting at the time. So that is going to wrap up our look at On Guard.
Okay, and the last game that we're going to talk about in this very long video on the post D&D games, post role-playing games that came out in 1975, it's going to be Empire the Petal Throne. Now, I have a whole video on this before. It was one of the first ones I did on my history series, so I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this, but basically this game, written by Professor Barker, there's a whole history of him. I discuss it in my other video, so just look to that if you want to know more. But was published by Professor Barker as a role-playing game in 1974. And so this is the cover of that original edition that he did. It was self-published, right? So this is, again, I keep coming back to this idea of like, when was something published? Was it published when it was self-published and distributed a few copies to some friends at a convention? Or was it published when it was actually by a major game publisher that then had it available commercially in outlets across the country? So either way you look at it, this was technically first published in 1974, which makes it, the second role-playing game, unless you want to, again, quibble with semantics and talk about rules to the game of Dungeons. So that's neither here nor there. But like the other games that we just discussed, Tunnels and Trolls, On Guard, and then Empire of the Petal Throne, all three first kind of really officially get distributed at Origins in 1975. Now, there are articles in Strategic Review magazine which would suggest that Empire of the Petal Throne maybe had been commercially available a little bit before that. So that might take the place then of the second published RPG, because Tunnels and Trolls, while that had some limited distribution in April of 1975 and then early in July at a very limited game convention, it didn't really officially get out until Origins of 1975. Okay, so couple of things in this particular game. My box is sadly falling apart. So this is a piece off the box, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to try to glue it back on here or if I should just leave it. But a couple innovations with this game. And again, I have a whole video to get into the mechanics in this, but some of the things that this particular game added. So this is a D&D derivative game, although it was not published as a campaign setting for D&D. I've talked about this before. It was published as a standalone role-playing game, but it has three classes: warrior, magic user, and priest. He calls them professions here, but that's essentially what they are. So priest being cleric. Okay, he's got alignment, good and evil. He's got the same 6 ability scores, kind of. So he swaps out charisma for comeliness. And then instead of wisdom, he's got psychic ability, but roughly same ability scores. However, these are determined based on a percentile basis, not a 3d6. So not a 3 to 18. And then interestingly, this is one of the first games, I think it might be the first role-playing game, since we're, talking about those, that has a skill system. So skill systems didn't exist. Skills in D&D weren't really a thing until officially 3rd edition, although if you want to count non-weapon proficiencies, then that happened in late 1st edition and then throughout 2nd edition. But in any event, this predates all of that. So skill systems. Now, what's interesting here is that he divides the skills into different areas, including profession skills. And profession skills for magic users are spells. So he calls them skills, but you can see from the list here, those are spells. So this is the one I still kind of maintain is the second role-playing game after D&D, because we know it was created in 1974 and it was self-published as early as 1974. So that beats Tunnels and Trolls being self-published in 1975 in April. And then you've got, On Garde, which is published and distributed in around July of 1975. And then you've got Boot Hill, which comes somewhere before that from TSR, although again, technically it's sort of a hybrid strategy game with some role-playing elements. So you could quibble that Boot Hill's not really a role-playing game if you want to get into semantics. Okay, but that's our look at these games. Thanks for sticking through this whole video. Again, I have a whole video on Empire of the Petal Throne if you want to know more. That's why I just kind of skipped past it. And also why I left it for last. So I want to thank you for watching this. And, I do think it's important, like people might wonder why did I want to make a video about the second role-playing game? Well, it's because we want to look at the history of how this hobby has evolved over time. And I think it's really interesting to see in 1975, you're seeing a bunch of things that, again, we take for granted now. So we're seeing 2 role-playing games that move outside of the traditional fantasy realm. So you've got Boot Hill in an Old West setting, and you've got On Guard in kind of that in real-world Earth setting in 17th century Paris. So you're moving outside of that traditional fantasy that you would see in, like, say, Tunnels and Trolls or Empire of the Petal Throne, even though this is more of like, you could quibble and say this is science fantasy, but you're seeing that. You're seeing the development of figuring out, well, what should the attributes be? And they're not always the same. None of the games have the same attributes as D&D. So that we just talked about, this was a little bit different. Tunnels and Trolls is probably the closest, but again, it's swapping out wisdom for luck. And in later editions, it's going to add 2 more ability scores. But you're seeing that. You're seeing mechanics of how to cast spells. You're seeing people play around with this stuff, because I think that's one of the things that D&D really kind of added to the gaming community, is this idea of hacking the idea of a role-playing game into something that you want that works for your table. And it might be doing it to emulate a specific genre, or like, say, Boot Hill. So those mechanics, as we talked about, are very, very different from D&D, but it was done to emulate a genre, but also what is most done in that genre, which is those 1-to-1 gunfights, right? Or something like a Tunnels and Trolls, which is really trying to simplify for people who maybe don't have a wargaming background that are interested in playing role-playing games. So there's reasons why people are doing this. And I think it's interesting that in, just a year after D&D getting published, you're starting to see the seeds of what's going to become this industry and the types of decisions that people are making when they're publishing games. So that's going to be it for this particular video. Again, thank you so very much for watching. I'll just quickly ask if you could give me a like if you enjoyed the video, and if you could subscribe if you haven't done so already. And commenting, those are the 3 best ways to help the YouTube algorithm to know to recommend me to other people. So I've been very fortunate. My last few videos have done better than my earlier ones. And so they're getting a little bit more traction on YouTube, which I really appreciate, but I'd love to keep it going. Let me know if you like this kind of topic. If you think that it's in depth enough or too much or not enough, let me know in the comments below. And let me know what you think about these particular games. If you play them, if you had a favorite, if there's something that, you wish I had covered, or something that you want to add, that's great too. And also, while you're below, you'll find links where you can find me on all the social media channels. And I would love to interact with you there. Sometimes it's easier to do comments and things on social media than it is here on YouTube. Often on YouTube, I get a little bit behind, and it starts to kind of spiral out of control. So if you've commented before and I haven't got back to you, please don't take it personally. I just haven't got there yet. And I will try to do so as soon as I can. And also below, you'll find you can find links to my blog where I do share content, and I'm trying to be a little bit more active on my blog now. YouTube's taking up most of my time. And lastly, for supporting my channel, the best way to do that is to buy something at my shop: a t-shirt, a hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, whatever that features exclusive designs. And I'm going to have more designs soon. I promise. I'll get to it as soon as I have a second. And that's all for now. So I'd like to say thank you so very, very much for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to while I made my notes for this particular video. So drinking wise, I was having a little bit of wine. So this was actually left over from a dinner that my wife and I had the night before. And this is a 2014 Beguiling by Law, which is based up in Paso Robles in Central California. So you can see I dripped a little bit on the label. Sorry, that doesn't look very attractive. But again, this is from Paso Robles. This particular winery is known for their Rhone style varietals. And as you can see here, this is 86% Grenache and 14% Syrah. So Grenache is one of my favorite single varietal grapes. Again, it's a Rhone style. I find it very food friendly. And so this is mostly Grenache with a little bit of Syrah. So these are aged in a mixture of some concrete, but then also in some small French oak barrels. And it's got this little bit of spice, but like cherry, raspberry. I really enjoyed it. It's very, very food friendly, as I said, but it's also something that I just enjoy sipping on kind of by itself, which is what I was doing with the little bit that was left over. So cheers. And then just feeling a little contemplative. So put on one of my favorite albums. I know I've talked about John Coltrane before, but I'm featured this album. This is A Love Supreme. Now, this is the complete masters. So it is a 6 LP set. Or 3 LP set, but 6 sides total. But featuring the original A Love Supreme album. And then it's got all these sessions from, different mixes, practices, alternate takes, mostly alternate takes in these other ones. So basically, this is originally recorded. It was recorded all in one session, December of 1964. And then the album was released in January of 1965. And it is what is known as, I just forgot the name. It's like through music or something like that. But basically the point of it is that each song, like they don't repeat and they move like from one to another. So this is a suite. And it starts out, and the most famous song on here is actually the first track, which is called Acknowledgement. And at the end of Acknowledgement, there's you get to hear John Coltrane's voice where he repeats over and over again, A Love Supreme. And so A Love Supreme, that's actually the way that the song starts out. So there's like kind of like a gong that happens. And then you hear Jimmy Garrison, who's playing bass on this. And he plays this 4-note riff, doo-doom, doo-doom, which ends up being repeated by John Coltrane on saxophone. But then he riffs on that. It's very modal in style. It's free jazz. So it can be a little bit challenging if you're just not used to this kind of thing. But it's very almost spiritual, and it was intended to be that. But at the end, you hear John Coltrane repeating this mantra of A Love Supreme. So he just says it over and over again, and that's where the album gets its name. But each track kind of leads into the next track. Like I said, it's a 4-part suite, and it was written at a period of time where John Coltrane had a lot of struggles with drugs, with heroin, particularly earlier in the mid to late 50s when he was playing with Miles Davis. And he finally kind of kicked that habit. And he really, to him, he realized that like he kicked that habit because of his spirituality. And so this album was sort of an acknowledgement of the struggles that he had been through, and a thanking from him to God, of saying like, thank you for helping me overcome this. And then it's talking about sort of like him celebrating his relationship with God and like what other people should have as well. So even if you're not spiritual, anything like that, you can listen to this album and still be affected by it. So this is something I actually just really enjoy to put on a weekend morning, particularly like Saturday or Sunday morning. Especially if I'm up early and my wife and daughter are still asleep, I can play this quietly and just kind of sit and think about it, and kind of just collect my thoughts for the day or the week coming up or something like that. So again, it's widely considered to be John Coltrane's masterpiece. If you haven't heard this album, please look it up on Spotify or YouTube or however you check out albums. And I encourage you to please just give it a listen. Like, try to really kind of focus on it and pay attention. Don't use it as background music, but use it as something that you're actually paying attention to. And I think you'll find that it is very, it's an affecting album. So anyway, I hope that you like it. Let me know in the comments below if it's something you've heard before or that you've tried out. And even if you didn't like it, that's fine. Let me know. But thanks again so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Please check out some of these other videos that are linked here. And cheers. And I will talk to you next time.